In the final phase of the Second World War, German tank crews climbed into the Panther with a confidence shaped by years of battlefield experience. The Panther was not simply another armored vehicle. It represented a specific philosophy of war, one rooted in engineering precision, calculated protection, and the belief that superior design could compensate for dwindling numbers. Its sharply sloped frontal armor, carefully hardened steel, and high-velocity 75mm gun were intended to dominate open terrain and defeat enemy armor before it could even respond. For a time, that belief held. On both the eastern and western fronts, the Panther earned a reputation that was as psychological as it was physical. Allied crews learned to respect it, plan around it, and whenever possible, avoid confronting it head-on. By late 1944, however, the strategic environment surrounding German armored forces had begun to change in ways that extended far beyond fuel shortages and air superiority. Allied ordnance laboratories, working quietly but relentlessly, had spent years dissecting German armor design. Captured tanks were measured, cut apart, and analyzed not for admiration, but for exploitation. Engineers studied armor thickness, slope angles, metallurgical composition, and failure points under stress. What emerged from this work was not a new tank or a revolutionary gun, but something far more subtle and ultimately more destabilizing. A new generation of armor-piercing ammunition designed specifically to defeat the Panther's most trusted protection. Unlike earlier shells that relied on explosive force or brute mass, these newer rounds were built around velocity, material density, and structural integrity at impact. Their designers understood that sloped armor was most effective against shells that deformed, shattered, or lost coherence when striking at high angles. The solution was not to overpower the armor with more explosives, but to pierce it cleanly, maintaining shape and energy long enough to pass through steel that had been carefully engineered to deflect conventional threats. This approach reflected a broader shift in modern warfare thinking, where incremental technological refinements could produce disproportionate battlefield effects. For German crews, the early signs were confusing and unsettling. Reports emerged of Panthers disabled by single frontal hits under conditions that should not have allowed penetration. At first, these incidents were dismissed as unlucky angles, ammunition fires, or mechanical failures. Tanks burn in war for many reasons, and experienced officers were reluctant to believe that a fundamental assumption about their most advanced armored vehicle might be wrong. Yet, as similar losses accumulated across different fronts, involving different Allied units and different guns, the pattern became harder to ignore. What made this development especially dangerous was not just the physical destruction of tanks, but the erosion of certainty. The Panther had been designed around the idea that its frontal armor could buy time to maneuver, return fire, or withdraw. If that guarantee no longer held, every tactical decision made inside the tank became more fragile. Crews began entering combat with doubt, and in armored warfare, doubt can be as lethal as any weapon. As the pattern of Panther losses became clearer, the underlying cause traced back to a quiet but consequential evolution in Allied ammunition doctrine. By the middle years of the war, Allied forces had learned that tank combat was no longer decided solely by gun caliber or armor thickness. It had become a contest between material science, manufacturing precision, and velocity management. German designers had anticipated heavier shells and larger guns. What they had not fully prepared for was ammunition engineered to preserve kinetic energy at the exact moment it mattered most, at impact. Several Allied programs converged on this goal. American ordnance engineers refined high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition using dense penetrator cores and improved ballistic shaping. British laboratories, drawing on earlier pre-war research, moved toward discarding sabot concepts that allowed smaller, harder penetrators to be fired at extremely high speeds. Soviet designers, operating under different industrial constraints, focused on improving steel quality, penetrator hardness, and consistency of manufacturing. These efforts were not coordinated in the political sense, but they were aligned by necessity. The Panther had forced a response, and that response arrived in the form of ammunition that treated armor slope not as an obstacle, but as a variable to be overcome. The key advantage of these improved shells was not explosive force, but structural survival. Earlier rounds often shattered or lost penetration efficiency when striking sloped armor at high velocity. The newer designs were engineered to remain intact long enough to punch through the armor plate before dissipating their energy. In controlled tests, these rounds demonstrated penetration characteristics that challenged assumptions embedded in German armor doctrine. Sloped steel could still deflect poorly constructed rounds. Against well-designed penetrators, however, slope alone was no longer a guarantee. On the battlefield, this translated into a dramatic change in engagement outcomes. Allied gunners who had once been trained to seek side shots or ambushes began discovering that frontal engagements were no longer automatically suicidal. This did not mean Panthers suddenly became easy targets. Range, angle, and shot placement still mattered enormously. But the margin of safety German crews had relied on was narrowing, sometimes disappearing entirely. German recovery teams examining destroyed Panthers noticed a disturbing consistency. Entry holes were often clean and sharply defined, with minimal surface spalling compared to earlier hits. Inside the tanks, damage was catastrophic. Penetrators that passed through the armor carried enough residual energy to ignite fuel, shatter internal components, or detonate stored ammunition. Crews had little time to react. The penetration itself was often survivable for fractions of a second. What followed almost never was. These findings challenged the Panther's foundational design logic. The tank had been built for a battlefield where armor slope created predictable outcomes. The arrival of improved Allied shells introduced uncertainty into that equation. German engineers understood what was happening. The problem was not ignorance. It was timing. By late 1944, Germany no longer possessed the industrial flexibility or material reserves needed to redesign its armored fleet in response. By the winter campaigns of 1944, the consequences of this technological shift were no longer theoretical. They were shaping battlefield behavior in ways that commanders on both sides could see almost immediately. German armored units that had once advanced with confidence began moving differently. Panthers paused longer before cresting ridgelines. They used terrain more conservatively, hesitated before committing to long-range duels, and increasingly relied on concealment rather than frontal presence. None of this was written into doctrine, but it appeared organically, the result of crews absorbing hard lessons from burned-out hulls scattered across roads and fields. For Allied forces, the psychological balance shifted in the opposite direction. Anti-tank gun crews and tank destroyer units that had previously viewed Panther encounters as exercises in survival rather than victory began reassessing their options. Training emphasized accuracy, rapid target acquisition, and disciplined fire rather than sheer numbers or desperate maneuvering. The knowledge that a frontal hit could succeed, even under limited conditions, altered how these units planned engagements. Guns were placed to control open approaches. Fire plans prioritized first-shot effectiveness. The goal was no longer merely to stop a Panther, but to kill it decisively before it could exploit its own firepower. This shift was especially significant because the Panther's 75mm gun remained extremely dangerous. Its long barrel and high muzzle velocity allowed it to destroy most Allied armor at ranges that favored German crews. The tank was still lethal. What changed was the assumption that it could absorb punishment long enough to dominate an engagement. Allied doctrine began treating Panther encounters as contests of initiative rather than inevitability. Whoever fired first, accurately, and under the right conditions, often decided the outcome. German commanders recognized the trend but faced limited options. Tactical adjustments were issued, emphasizing ambush tactics, hull-down positions, and coordinated infantry support. Panthers were instructed to avoid prolonged exposure and withdraw quickly after firing. These measures reduced losses in some situations but carried their own costs. More cautious use of armor limited operational flexibility. Tanks that hesitated or remained hidden too long ceded ground to Allied infantry and artillery. The Panther's greatest strength, its ability to impose control over open terrain, was being constrained not by enemy numbers, but by uncertainty. At the strategic level, the loss of confidence had compounding effects. Panthers were expensive to build and increasingly difficult to replace. Every vehicle destroyed by a clean frontal penetration represented not just material loss, but the erosion of an elite capability Germany could no longer regenerate. Crews knew this. So did their commanders. As a result, armor was husbanded, preserved, and sometimes withheld from decisive engagements where it might once have been committed without hesitation. The improved shell did not render the Panther obsolete overnight, but it undermined the conditions that had made it dominant. In doing so, it transformed tank combat from a predictable hierarchy into a volatile exchange where assumptions failed quickly and survival depended on adaptation. The effects of this shift became even more pronounced as combat spread across multiple fronts under increasingly unfavorable conditions for German forces. On the Western Front, Allied advances compressed the battlefield, forcing Panther units to operate in environments where long-range dominance was difficult to maintain. Hedgerows, villages, forests, and ruined urban terrain reduced sightlines and limited maneuver space. These conditions magnified the danger posed by improved anti-armor ammunition. Panthers could no longer rely on distance alone to shield them from accurate fire. Engagements unfolded quickly, often at ranges where the new shells retained both velocity and penetration efficiency. On the Eastern Front, the situation was harsher still. Soviet forces applied relentless pressure with massed artillery, aggressive reconnaissance, and layered anti-tank defenses. Panthers were increasingly committed to delaying actions rather than decisive counterattacks. In these roles, they were forced to reveal themselves repeatedly, firing from exposed positions to cover infantry withdrawals. Each exposure increased the risk of encountering guns equipped with upgraded armor-piercing rounds. Soviet crews, hardened by years of brutal armored combat, adapted rapidly. They coordinated fire, adjusted aim points, and exploited terrain to ensure that the first hit was also the most damaging. German engineers continued analyzing battlefield reports, hoping to identify a tactical workaround rather than a material solution. Some proposed thicker frontal plates or modified armor angles. Others suggested spaced armor configurations or additional steel track links welded to vulnerable areas. In practice, these measures offered limited protection. Added weight strained already unreliable drivetrains, while improvised armor often failed to disrupt high-velocity penetrators designed to remain intact after initial impact. Even when modifications succeeded locally, they could not be standardized or distributed at scale. Time, resources, and industrial capacity had all slipped beyond reach. Inside the tanks, the psychological strain deepened. Crews understood that penetration was no longer an abstract possibility but a recurring event. The sound of incoming fire carried new meaning. A single sharp impact could trigger internal fires within seconds, filling the fighting compartment with smoke, heat, and toxic fumes. Escape required immediate action, yet was often obstructed by damage or flame. Survivors carried these experiences into subsequent engagements, their caution shaped by memory rather than instruction. Allied planners recognized what this meant. Armor no longer needed to be neutralized through elaborate encirclement alone. It could be confronted directly when conditions favored the shooter. This understanding reinforced momentum. As Allied units advanced, the Panther's declining ability to halt assaults accelerated operational collapse. The improved shell did not win battles by itself, but it stripped German armor of the psychological and tactical leverage it once wielded, tipping a balance that could not be restored. By early 1945, the Panther's reputation had shifted decisively, and with it, the character of late-war armored combat. German tank crews still respected their machine, but respect had replaced confidence. The distinction mattered. Confidence encouraged decisive action. Respect bred caution. Panthers were increasingly committed only when alternatives had been exhausted, often as fire brigades rushed to plug collapsing fronts. In these situations, the improved Allied shells exerted their greatest influence. The Panthers arrived late, under pressure, and frequently into prepared kill zones where Allied gunners expected them and understood how to defeat them. This phase of the war revealed a broader truth about technological competition under wartime conditions. The Panther itself had been a response to earlier Allied tanks, a machine designed to overmatch threats it encountered in 1941 and 1942. But by 1944, the cycle had completed another turn. Allied forces no longer needed a superior tank in every engagement. They needed the ability to reliably neutralize Germany's best, and improved ammunition provided that capability faster and more efficiently than redesigning entire armored fleets. The impact extended beyond immediate battlefield losses. German operational planning became increasingly conservative. Panthers were assigned defensive roles, positioned to delay rather than dominate. This restricted their ability to influence campaigns at the operational level. Where once armored thrusts could alter the tempo of battle, Panthers now functioned as obstacles, buying hours or days rather than reshaping outcomes. Allied commanders exploited this shift, advancing with calculated aggression, aware that German armor no longer held the same deterrent value. From an engineering perspective, the lesson was stark. Armor and weapon systems do not exist in isolation. They are part of a constantly evolving interaction between protection, penetration, and perception. The shell that defeated the Panther was not revolutionary in appearance. It did not announce itself with a new silhouette or dramatic mechanical innovation. Its power lay in incremental refinement, in understanding precisely how and where existing assumptions would fail under real combat conditions. In the final months of the war, burned Panthers littered roads, fields, and forest edges, their hulks serving as silent evidence of this shift. To Allied troops, they marked progress. To German crews, they were warnings. The Panther had not become weak. The battlefield had changed around it. And in that change, a seemingly modest technological advance had reshaped the balance between armor and firepower. In retrospect, the story of the Panther and the shell that defeated it is less about a single weapon and more about how wars are actually won. The German Panther remained, on paper, one of the most formidable tanks of the Second World War. Its gun was lethal, its armor intelligently designed, and its battlefield record formidable. What changed was not the tank itself, but the environment in which it fought. Allied forces learned that they did not need to outbuild or outgun every German system. They needed to understand it deeply enough to undermine its core assumptions. The improved armor-piercing shell achieved exactly that. It attacked the Panther's promise of protection, the idea that angled steel could reliably buy time and safety in the chaos of combat. Once that promise collapsed, everything downstream followed. Tactics shifted. Crew behavior changed. Command decisions became more cautious. A weapon designed to dominate open ground became something to preserve, conceal, and ration. That transformation mattered as much as any physical penetration. This lesson carried forward into the Cold War and beyond. Military planners absorbed the reality that small, focused technological advances could neutralize far larger investments. Ammunition, sensors, guidance systems, and material science often reshaped battlefields faster than platforms themselves. The Panther was not defeated by a single dramatic breakthrough, but by an accumulation of understanding translated into a precise tool applied at the right moment. In that sense, the burned-out Panthers left behind in 1945 were more than wrecks. They were markers of a transition in warfare, from dominance rooted in armor and mass to dominance rooted in information, testing, and adaptation. It was a warning every future armored force would eventually face. No advantage remains permanent once its logic is fully understood. If you want more deep, historically grounded analyses of military technology, doctrine, and the moments where assumptions collide with reality, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for the next breakdown.